But before I get started, I want to actually tell a story because it caused me to reframe my entire presentation today. So bear with me, it's the first time I'm actually presenting this content. So a couple weeks back, I had the opportunity to travel to Dubai for work. And while in Dubai, I got to lead an executive technical roundtable with folks from various industries that were just trying to figure out how and where should I apply generative AI to my business. And in this conversation, one of the topics that came up was some of the open source models that recently had gotten released, specifically Llama 3.1 and 3.2. And one of the healthcare industry leaders spoke up and said, how can these models be applied to the healthcare industry? And at first I thought, oh, he wants to get inspiration or he wants to understand where there's been successes. But as I started to double click into what he was really asking me about, what I learned was he had started his AI journey, like many of us, with ChatGPT and the consumer version, knew and understand how that data was being utilized to retrain the model over time, and was nervous that open source models took the same approach. So really his question was rooted, and this totally took me by surprise, in that he was worried that if he sent patient data to the open source model that was running in his hosted systems, that Meta was going to take that data and then reintegrate it into the model. And so it got us on a really interesting track around how does data, models, and systems all integrate into one another, and how do these various models utilize data. So that inspired me to reframe my entire conversation today. And while I know the answer to this, which, you know, how many of you are using ChatGPT, it's probably this entire room, what I actually want to ask you guys is, how many of you guys are using the consumer version of OpenAI? Like, just, you know, okay, great, almost everyone. How many of you guys are actually taking their APIs and building it into applications and using it to build? Okay, great, many of you guys as well. So how many of you guys feel you understand their data policies and the differences between how your data is being used in the consumer model or the enterprise model? How many of you guys fully feel like you understand it? There's only 2 hands up in this whole room. Yeah, it's confusing, and you know, this conversation really inspired me to start digging into this because I fundamentally believe that it is all of our responsibilities to take our values as humans and integrate them into what we're building. And so I was like, I feel like I'm a lawyer now. I'm like sifting through all of these policy docs and also trying to understand more about licensing and open source. And so that inspired me to change this talk. So the first thing I want to start with is, as you're building AI applications and systems, how does it work? I mean, I think many of us are not interfacing directly with a model API. We're interfacing in some way with a system or an ecosystem that is surrounding the models that you're actually interacting with. And how does this work? So use cases, that's really important. We've already talked about that, but I'm going to assume that you have a good use case you're tackling. To execute that use case, you're actually building models, probably several models at this point, into a system or an integration workflow. And as you're actually calling these various models, you're taking input data or a prompt or a mix of both, and you're sending that into the model. There's various different types of models out there, from different sizes to different training mechanisms to open source to proprietary, that you're probably sending these input prompts to, and that model is then generating the output. And the combination of these built into a workflow is how you execute your use case. And as you work with various models, you're probably doing some sort of evaluation to determine, is that model going to work for my use case? And you're probably double-clicking and doing a workflow evaluation or an in-context evaluation as well. So that being said, one of the core components of how you have to interface with the models and what you need to start with is actually starting with your model selection. Where are you going to host that model? And through this entirety of the process, how are you going to handle user data and also just general data that this application or model is going to interface with? So I wanted to kind of start us by talking about number 2 and number 3. So we're going to talk a little bit about data handling and and a little bit about model selection and hosting, because I can't talk about everything today. We only have a fixed amount of time. So I'm gonna actually skip ahead and then go back. So I wanna actually start with model selection. There's tons of options out there. Despite that probably many of us got introduced to generative AI through ChatGPT, and it's a great model, don't get me wrong, it's not what I'm trying to advocate here, but there is choice now. And there's a ton of choice and progression in the open source community. And also too, there has been many great models since OpenAI released theirs in the proprietary model side. But what I want to focus this conversation on is not what is the best model, because that's going to depend on lots of circumstances that may not even relate to responsible AI. But I want to focus on 5 key areas: data security, update control, customization, transparency, and quality. So first of all, with data security, we talked earlier about understanding data policies. Many of us don't understand it. It's complicated. And I think one benefit of open source is you have choice. And that's what I personally think is amazing about the progression of the open source models. First of all, you have choice on where and how you host it. Do you want to use an inference service provider? Do you want to use your cloud service providers or your hyperscalers? Do you want to do this on-premise? You can then manage data retention, storage, and all the management is within your control. On the open source side, these models typically have providers that host them, and they're the only providers that can host them. If you think about, if you can take OpenAI, except for their open source versions, and run it on your own hardware, or choose where you host that, you can't. And data is then, because of that, sent outside of your organization to whatever vendor is hosting this. And vendors have various data policies, and these are complicated to understand. Some support zero-day retention, for example. Some have other retention policies. But even those that support the zero-day retention, meaning when you send a prompt in, you're actually storing, logging it, and retaining it. If you want zero-day retention, you actually have to request it. It's not the default. And they have to actually approve it. That's also not given. So it's really complicated to handle. The next is around update control. When you think about open source, you have full control over when you update it and if you update it. Whereas the proprietary models, they can happen anytime that model provider wants to make an update. Granted, they're usually pretty good about giving you notice and kind of communicating the changes and giving you an opportunity to test and understand what changes you're going to have to make. However, at a certain point in time, you're probably going to get forced because they have to maintain their models, and it's a lot of technical debt to keep them. The next is around customization. So with open source models, you have the opportunity to fully customize those models. You have typically access to at least the weights and the ability to actually go and make changes there, but also too, a lot of the open source providers also share the data on how that model was actually trained. Not all of them do. Some are more open weights versus fully open source, but a lot of them do.